Welcome to part 3 of our Cold Steel Saber comparison series. In this episode, we're going to take a look at what Cold Steel calls their 1830 Napoleon saber, and we'll talk about that naming in just a second here because 1830 and Napoleon don't go together. I figure there was probably a miscommunication or typo in the naming of the product. But this is certainly, I would say, the most elaborate of the three, with that classic French brass 3-bar hilt construction. Has a steel scabbard that does have some lining to it. We'll talk about that in a second. Also, the one with the longest blade of the three, and it has the distinction of being the one of the three we're looking at that I modified by far the least. Let's start by talking about the steel scabbard. And as steel scabbards go, I'm going to say, even though this one is very plain, it's very well fit. There are at least partial liners in here that may actually be wood instead of the cheap plastic I've been seeing on some of the other cold steel offerings. And that creates a very nice level of fit and retention. It's not going anywhere accidentally if it tips. In fact, so well fit in there that if I stabilize the rattle of the rings, yeah, blade's not rattling in there at all when it's locked in. Now that does create a little bit of drag on the draw for about, I would say, the first 4 or 5 inches, 10, 12 centimeters, but after that it flies free. Now at that point you also start hearing a lot of metal scrape, and that is front to back, spine, and yes, have to keep the edge off the material to keep the scabbard from diminishing the blade. But otherwise, yes, really impressed with the fit. But one of the downsides of the steel scabbard compared to other options is how much it weighs and how much that then adds to your overall carry weight. How much weight are we talking about? Well, in this case, the scabbard alone weighs 1 pound 10 ounces, about 737 grams. Almost the weight of a whole other sword. But because it is a solid piece of steel, could provide you with a secondary weapon if you needed it, or at least a parrying device that's not going to be easily cut through. Let me give you a close-up look at the friendly end because, yeah, there's a whole lot going on here, starting with a pretty robust brass construction. That is a classic French 3-bar hilt, and we'll talk about hand protection versus symmetry and balance in the handling. Got a hook on the back. We'll talk about these other embellishments here in a moment. Brass back strap that goes into the pommel that has a cut for a thumb ramp. We'll get right back to that topic, believe me. Smooth leather grip that appears to have a coil of what I'm assuming is cord underneath, so there's no braided wire over the top. But before we talk about the other details, talk about some interesting things in construction and dimension. Starting with, okay, you can see slots for what looks like some sort of sleeve screw, but the tang is coming clean through it, and it looks like they then peened it over and polished it smooth, so I don't think it's coming apart. Is there a pin through the tang under these decorative bits here, or are they just decorative bits? I don't know. So far with some pretty substantial use, nothing's come loose. There are no flaws, no hot spots, no sharp edges, anything like that. But also, okay, it's a pretty girthy grip. I'd say very similar to some of my Japanese style Suka, or similar to the Cold Steel 1796 we looked at, though it doesn't have that prominent palm swell. It's a straight front strap. But a couple things you might be concerned with. All right, here, the space in here, the other sabers we've been looking at are more substantial. I mean, the Thompson had 5 inches, 1796 had 4 1/4. You've only got 3 3/4 inches in there, about 9.5 centimeters. Now, I've described my hands as being medium width, but very short, stubby fingers. So, yeah, I've got room for my hand. But speaking of that thumb ramp, if I choke all the way down, I can get my thumb on the back without ramming it into the guard, but just barely. If you've got longer thumbs than mine, you're going to have to choke way down, get that pommel into the hollow of your palm. So depending on how you operate one of these. I can also grip it in other ways. Speaking of which, let's talk about some of those bits and bobs. Okay, these features mid-grip. Don't know the official name for them, but they're nicely rounded over. They kind of make interesting tactile indexing points, almost like Minuki on a Japanese-style sword. But I was worried about how I would interface with these languettes that stick down into the grip. Now, they are nicely rounded over. Again, no sharp edges anywhere. I thought they would be in my way, but I've actually discovered I can use them as leverage points for my thumb. We'll talk about that more in handling. Hang in there for the extreme close-up in the history trivia as we try to unravel the correct nomenclature for the sword, because Cold Steel calling it an 1830 Napoleon, those two things don't go together, but they also refer to it as an AN-11. French Revolutionary Republican year 11, which for the rest of us would have been 1802 to 1803, so maybe they meant to say 1803, which this model does strongly resemble the 1803 French saber, which didn't go into wide military service for several years after that, but inscribed on the back in some loose loopy cursive with some abbreviations, as far as we can tell, because a lot of other swords have a similar inscription in terms of historic examples. And yes, my French pronunciation is beyond horrible, so my French viewers might correct me later, but Manufacture Imperiale, Imperial Manufacturer Factory du Klingenthal. Klingenthal was a very common center for sword production in Alsace. And then the date October 1813. Now, these inscriptions were usually on 1813 French sabers, which had a somewhat different guard on them, specifically here at the back. So is this supposed to be an 1803 or an 1813? All right, let's talk about the business end, what I have done to it, and all the things I felt I didn't have to do to it from the factory to get it, well, where I like it, and compare it to the other two sabers in this series. Now, like the other two sabers in the series, this is another 1055 high carbon that my test files are saying probably around 5152 HIC, which is great for a through hardened steel sword. Cold Steel says they put these through British proof tests. Blade length, though, this is the longest of the three. The other two pretty much had the same blade from the factory. 32 inches long, 81 centimeters, and I'm measuring that in a straight line from the guard to the tip. This is 34 inches, so 86 centimeters. Width front to back, just a little bit skinnier. 1 3/16 of an inch, about 3 centimeters. The other ones were closer to 3.5 centimeters. Distal taper, right in the same range, 7 millimeters thick at the base of the spine. Ogive of the tip, a little bit under 3 millimeters. Distal flex, yeah, definitely more towards the pointy end. Flexible, but not floppy. We'll take a look at some thrusting tests. Finish on the blade, not quite a mirror polish, but not quite a satin polish either. The lines are pretty good. They're not perfectly even and crisp, but they're not bad. I would say similar in quality, especially with that square termination at the base of the fuller, to the Thompson as compared to the earlier 1796 model, so perhaps Cold Steel is simply improving their quality. And speaking of which, okay, what did I do to the sword versus the things I did to the other swords, which included a little bit to a lot of bit of reprofiling steel removal to improve weight and balance. I didn't have to do those things here. It did come to me with a sharpened secondary edge bevel. It was pretty good. It was kind of toothy, a little bit steep, so I went ahead and improved it just for my tastes. Also, like the other ones, yeah, the false edge was not sharpened. There was about 1 millimeter blunt. Went ahead and gave that a sharp edge. Otherwise, didn't take off a significant amount of steel. But let's talk about, okay, weight and balance and why I had to remove more steel on the other ones. All right, from the factory, weight is kind of in the middle of the other two swords. Looking down at my notes to keep it straight, Thompson came to me about 2 pounds 1 ounces, 935 grams. The 1796 came to me feeling pretty heavy for what it was at 2 pounds 3 ounces, 992 grams. This one, still pretty much its original factory weight, 2 pounds 2 ounces, 964 grams, but more importantly, point of balance. Those other ones came to me with point of balances out here, 8.5, 8.25 inches. This one, from the factory, 6 inches, 15 centimeters. I was not prepared for how well this sword felt and moved for me right out of the box. In the last 2 saber reviews, we took a pass on the paper cutting test and went straight to seeing how this edge will push through a piece of corrugated cardboard. That is a really close result between this one and the Thompson. No damage. All right, what did you just see? Well, as I mentioned in the last 2 videos, I'm still working out my ideal sword testing protocol, so it is a work in progress. But I started with thrusting, stabbing into, well, first my pel, which is multiple layers of thick cardboard backed up by a couple of inches of pressed brown paper, paper up against my redwood target, and then to test harder impacts straight into the redwood. What am I looking for? Penetration and channel into the softer target media. This has a nice acute point, broad enough and curved enough blade to make really deep, wide channels into the softer target media, though there are some specific challenges we'll talk about again when it comes to thrusting, stabbing with a really curved blade. Into the harder target, I'm looking for tip durability, but in both I want to see how it translates impact back into my hand. Does my hand stay put on the grip? And this is a fairly grippy grip in the front, but slick back straps can be a challenge. Didn't really notice it here because I have these features here that do kind of grab my hand back and keep it put. Now, I don't have near enough room that I'm going to risk putting my thumb up on the back saber style thrusting and stabbing because I'm just asking for a busted thumbnail here. So I'm going to keep my thumb more around the side. But yeah, stayed put, no uncomfortable collisions. Now the other thing I'm testing here is blade flex. So I was specifically engaging the target in either, well, basically a seconde or a cot angle. Blade horizontal, facing away from the camera, facing toward the camera. So you could see it flex. Now if I threw my hand up over the tip in the impact, you tended to see more flex than when I was more conservative and keeping my hand straight behind the tip. But you can see a good amount of flex. We'll compare the 3 swords here in a minute. Finally, I know you've been waiting for that. But even flexing significantly, it didn't take any kind of set or other damage. So I'm going to say in the thrusting tests for a really curved sword, it did really well. Next test, hacking and slashing into a piece of hard bamboo. I'm looking to see if I can induce a chip or roll on a fragile edge. I'm not hitting it hard. I'm not trying to chop the thing in half. I'm hitting it about the force and speed I would use when I'm fencing. And that also gives me a sense of how nimble the sword is in doing that against a semi-resistant target. And this one took no damage and moved really well. Again, we'll get to the comparisons in a second. So test passed. Final test, cutting. As I mentioned in the last 2 videos, I don't do much cutting whatsoever. I also, because of recycling restrictions in my area, don't do water bottles or pool noodles, can't afford tatami. So I take the risk of cutting cardboard, which can be really abrasive, damaging to a blade. In this case, what I've decided to go with is just cutting horizontally through panels, because one, horizontal cuts are some of the most challenging for me, but also they give me good consistent feedback, because what I usually cut to test is the edge on a new blade or an edge I've improved or working with a weapon that I'm not very familiar with. And as I mentioned in the other two videos, blades that are really curved can be advantageous in cutting, but compared to straighter profile blades, I have to get a little bit more into a specific kind of draw cut mechanic and often start a bit lower on the blade, which means I have to get closer to the target, have to make some adjustments. But yeah, this cut really, really well with minimal edge improvement. Okay, finally, how do the three compare in the tests? All right, episode 3, the moment you've probably been waiting for since episode 1. Side-by-side comparison, at least for this part, how they did in the tests that I ran. As you saw, well, because of that tip geometry, in the thrusting and stabbing, penetration was not great. It was dumping more impact, hitting a lot more like a shovel than a needle. Also, because of the way the blade got thinned out, it had the most flex, but didn't take any damage, didn't take a set. Also had a little slickness with that, smooth back strap in the grip, so I had to adjust for that and work with the extreme curve. So when it comes to flexibility, this was the most flexible. The Napoleon takes the middle slot in terms of flexibility, but wins in terms of penetration. Also for me, tip accuracy on target. The most solid blade when it comes to flex, and the one in the middle of the field when it comes to penetration, is the Thompson. Now when it comes to the bamboo test, one of the things, they all pass the edge durability aspect of it, but I was also looking for how nimble they are, because I'm not trying to chop through the bamboo. I'm engaging it like I would engage when I'm fencing. Gives me a sense of how nimble the sword is, and yeah, this was the most sluggish one to maneuver quickly, but it wasn't terrible. This one would be number 2 in that field when it comes to nimbleness, and I think some of that's because of the slickness of the grip. And yeah, I had to adjust because of the extreme curvature. Maneuverability winner against the bamboo, Napoleon. Final test, cutting. Okay. This one, well, I think I struggled with because I've had the least practice with it, and I may still need to improve that edge a little bit more. It cut well, but with less work done on it, I'm going to say the Napoleon and the Thompson cut better. Now, I did a little bit more edge improvement on the Thompson, but I had cardboard tested it before I did that, and they were both running pretty well neck and neck. Where the difference came in is how much more blade authority this one has. So if you like more oomph in your blade when you're cutting, I would go with this one. If you want one that's quicker, lighter, nimbler, and has a bit more reach, this would be your cutting winner. And this one was the one I did the least edge improvement to. Which one did I enjoy cutting with the most? This one. All right, so another bear with me recap moment. If you've already seen this discussion twice in the last 2 chapters, feel free to fast forward a couple, 3 minutes. It won't hurt my feelings. Well, first off, what are my criteria for evaluating swords? First, specs. Does the thing fit me? Second and third, summed up by certain people asking if the sword is battle ready. They're asking, will it cut? Now, my concern for cutting mechanics, since I'm not primarily a target cutter, might be different from yours. We'll get back to that in martial capacity. But they're also asking, is it going to break if I hit stuff with it? Is it durable? And yeah, I'm going to check that. And some of my tests are arguably at least semi-abusive, but I need to know. The final criteria is pretty complicated, and that comes down to its martial capacity. Now with a weapon of length, I'm going to be judging its defensive and offensive capability. Do I feel confident protecting myself, parrying, blocking, displacing an opponent's attack? Yeah, that's going to be an important question, but also what is its counter-attacking capacity? So that gets us back to cutting mechanics, blade geometry, and yes, tip geometry. But as we've discussed with a weapon like this, I'm using the curve, maybe not in the way you're thinking to give myself a monster target cutter, but in the way it can hook around corners, guards, obstacles to get that tip in places it might be unexpected, and it can roll into that very quickly upon contact with the opponent's guard or weapon. It's also why I like having the option of the sharpened back edge, because I can back cut while I'm doing that. I can also use the curvature of the spine to kind of give a little bit of hook into my parries and binds to control the opponent's weapon, and in doing so I'm often inserting the business end into a gap that they're going to have trouble dealing with. While I'm doing that, it's nice to have some kind of hook or guard down here at the bottom just in case the sword slides down towards my hand. And this has that. But the final criteria is the sword, well, it gets us back to specs. Does it feel responsive in my hand? Do I have the confidence that I'm going to be able to use this effectively against a responsive, reactive, unpredictable opponent who might be variously armed, might not be an equal confrontation? So let's talk about this one, and then I'll give you my final impressions. Which do I think is the best of the three for me, martially speaking? All right, I'm going to go ahead and start with the friendly end because there were a couple of pleasant surprises here. I thought some of these features were going to get in my way, but I found that I can rest my thumb on that extended languette very nicely, and it gives me, it's kind of like the Facone grip we've been talking about with sizable knives, gives me that little extra push. Not quite what a thumb ring would do for you, but close. So not only is it not in my way, it's not a hot spot, but I've actually learned how to use it to, well, maneuver the sword that much quicker. The grip is reasonably grippy. Otherwise, it is a little bit narrow in here, so it does restrict the ways I can grip it. Definitely can't easily get my thumb on the back for saber grip. So it's going to be floating over here on the side on that extended languette. But yes, okay, the guard is nice and beefy. It is brass. I do worry about the durability of brass. But it is this traditional 3-bar, which is designed for ease of carry to sit flat on one side against your body. But it definitely favors protection of a right-handed swordsman. It isn't really giving much of anything at all for my thumb. Now, those languettes in the back hook might protect me a little bit. I can also use profiles of engagement where my sword kind of, shall we say, hides in the shadow of the blade, so there are those techniques. But when I shift it to my left hand, okay, now the whole back of my hand is exposed. And my thumb is a little bit restricted by the bar. Now, I've had some friends who cut one of these bars off to make the sword less biased, but I don't want to do that. I want to keep the traditional design. But yes, that bias also, because it is a pretty chunky brass thing, puts more weight on this side, so it does feel a little bit lopsided that way in the hand. But not enough that it really bothers me, unless it's in my left hand and then it feels strange. But as for the business end, all right. Now, comparatively speaking, specs-wise, this is the least blade forward of the three. But I still feel like I have enough authority, durability, to be able to parry, block, displace an opponent's sword, protect myself, and I feel like I have enough hand protection also, even though it's a little lopsided. As for offensive capability, I feel like the cutting mechanics of this blade, martially speaking, are wonderful. And yes, as we've been talking about with these curved sabers, it gets around corners very nicely. Got the sharpened back edge and all of that, and I can hook and control with the curvature of the spine. Yeah, I really feel like I can use it offensively and defensively. And yes, of the three, okay, spoiler alert, the most nimble of the three, even though it's the longest. it's kind of quick in my hand, so I can transition out of a cut. This is also one that, even with my damaged wrist, yeah, I'm really not good at just cutting with a saber from the wrist because of all my hand and wrist damage. But yeah, this one of the three is going to be the most nimble, responsive in those sort of fencing applications. And yeah, I do a lot of cross-training with these. So you will catch me doing one-handed Japanese-style swordsmanship with a saber. I've even done, a little bit of axe-sword with it. That's a thing that I've done. So it's possible with a little bit of adaptation. And as I mentioned, I have really come to love what these curved swords can do for you, martially speaking. Didn't used to love them. Now I really do. But okay, final conclusion, martially speaking, which of the three is my favorite, if you haven't already figured that out? All right, the moment I think you've all been waiting for, at least, and we've already discussed how they performed against each other in the testing, but which is my favorite in my martial arts practice? All right, so third place, I'm sorry, it's still going to be the 1796. And it's not just, it's got the least guard. The other ones were somewhat better cutters. Slippy grip, that's one thing that kind of got in its way. So maybe there's something I could do about that. But I think the bottom line is, even though I only spent about $200 US for this sword like I did with the other ones, I had to do so much to this thing to get it to be usable that I think you are ultimately better off saving your money and getting the windlass or the LK Chen. And if you have the windlass or the LK Chen, definitely let me know what you think of those, because I think I'm going to be saving my money to get something that potentially could be better than this one, because there are some things I still definitely like and appreciate about it. All right, middle of the field. It's a bit of a hard decision, but yeah, at this point anyway, I'm going to say the Thompson. And that is really only because of the heftier blade. But I do appreciate what that heftier blade does for me and the workout it's giving me. And I do really like the grippiness and the more balanced shell guard. So defensive capability, responsiveness, it's affected by the weight. Cutting capacity was pretty awesome. Blade geometry across the three is very similar, except one does have a longer blade. But yeah, this is a very close second place for me to, yep, my current favorite cold steel is the Napoleon. And I didn't think it was going to be. I thought it would be just too weird. But a combination of, well, certain things that those grip features do for me. Blade is a bit longer if that's important to you. Not necessarily in my practice, but it certainly can be a useful thing tactically speaking. But that point of balance of the three, even though they pretty much, well, weigh very close to each other, makes this one just the most responsive, quickest weapon in my hand. So I've got that. That's wonderful. So yeah, it just moves for me and does all the things I like it to do. But next we have to compare to some windlass offerings. So stay tuned for that. Otherwise, well, let me know what you thought of the conclusion, or if you have any other sabers to recommend. Until next time, thank you all so much as always for watching. Liking the video, subscribing, following my journey, putting up with my madness, and I hope to see you back for not only more sword content, but yes, more saber content.